If thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of?
About a year ago, and a couple of months after October 7th, I made a video in which I shared my thoughts on what I felt about the war that was just beginning to ramp up. Now, a year later, I've had a lot of mixed feelings about this, dependent on how salient the arguments that I was listening to have been, and they have been plenty salient from both sides over the past year. I've tried to stay clear of this topic for several reasons. For one, it seemed so incendiary a topic that no two people with a difference of opinion were able to have a good faith conversation about it and maintain their relationship afterwards. It also felt like my own opinions were not grounded enough. Being the human that I am just as susceptible to these emotional arguments as the next person. I've sometimes felt as though Israel was being a little too heavy-handed with their response, while other times I felt like they were in an impossible situation in which there was really no good way to address this. As such, I felt uncomfortable expressing any more than I had already. But given all this time that has passed, I've had a lot of time to think, reflect, read, and learn more about this topic. And although I still had no plans of revisiting this topic with a more educated opinion, I was inspired by this video that I saw of Konstantin Kissin from the channel Triggernometry, who I respect very much for his ability to stay objective and to follow the facts where they lead. So I decided to express my reaction to his video while also expressing my disagreement, which are not that many. I got an enormous amount of clarity from watching his video, and I hope it would help you too in clearing all the weed from the chaff when it comes to your thoughts on this issue. I hope you enjoy.
Exactly a year ago, when thousands of Hamas militants crossed Israel's border to engage in an orgy of medieval violence, I knew little about Israel and had no opinion about the long-running conflict there. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Gaza. I've never been to the West Bank. It's not a conflict I studied at university or read about extensively. People on both sides who care passionately about this issue find it hard to believe, but in truth, most people are like this. That's why, for many months after the October 7th attacks, I avoided commenting on the war or even discussing it on our show. Instead, I read, watched, and listened to the endless commentary, debates, and discussions to understand what people on various sides were saying. Having gathered those perspectives, I then did my best to apply first principles thinking to the arguments I heard. Thinking from first principles means stripping whatever you're trying to analyze down to its core and working back from there. Context is extremely important to understanding, but when it comes to highly emotive situations like this one, people often flood you with emotional context which does not support the argument they're actually making. There are some obvious examples in this debate which we will address shortly. First principles thinking helps you see the structure of arguments. The logic of an argument is like the skeleton of a body. You cannot see it from the outside, but it is usually the cause of why the body moves the way that it does. Getting to the skeleton of an argument is essential to understanding it. This was my approach when we had prominent pro-Palestine guests like Bassem Youssef and Norman Finkelstein on Triggernometry, as well as pro-Israel guests like Ben Shapiro and Natasha Hausdorff. It was also my approach when I hosted a fiery debate on the subject at Dissident Dialogues, and when Safety Namus invited me to discuss this issue on his podcast. So what does first principle thinking tell us about the conflict? First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible.
I'm not sure most people believe October 7th was a terrorist attack. I'd like to think a good number do, but there is a certain narrative, especially on the left, that holds that October 7th was not a terrorist attack because it was oppressed fighting against the injustices of the oppressors, and it's as simple as that. Of course, I don't agree with that, but I think it's good to flag that as possibly a central point that Konstantin is going to be hinging a lot of his arguments on here. He may pivot later on to address people who think October 7th was not a terrorist attack, but something tells me that most of this video is going to focus on an audience who agree that October 7th was a terrorist attack.
For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11. That isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since.
So that's a crucial point to remember, the scale of this attack when viewed from the Israeli perspective. These are people who are surrounded by people who consider them to be their enemies. If you consider the impact of 9/11 and the emotional weight that that had on many of us, in spite of the fact that most people in the US did not have any close or even remote connection to the victims of that attack, other than the fact that we all live in the same country, if you then extrapolate from that to a country that is much smaller the size of the US, suffering an attack that was much worse than what we experienced on 9/11, proportionally speaking, and you then think about what consequences and what ways that they should have reacted that would have been appropriate, this might give you a better glimpse of what Israelis must have been feeling and why they felt the need to react as they did after the attack.
In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of? Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable. However, there are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp.
He made a pretty good point right there. If Mexico were to attack the US like that, how would we respond? Some people might dismiss this analogy off the bat and say it's not a good analogy because the US and the Mexican relationship is very different from the Palestine and Israeli relationship. But it's worth remembering that once upon a time, not that long ago, there were a lot of ancestral Mexicans living here in North America who were then pushed south while the Pilgrims expanded. And can we justify any Mexican attacks, incursions, savagery into the US based on that history? Is that history enough to vindicate any sort of attack that disgruntled Mexicans might feel the US deserves? And if we still insist that this analogy doesn't fit, then we can consider Native Americans. How tolerant would we be if Native Americans were to start attacking American citizens because they claim that, historically speaking, this was the land that belongs to them? Not to mention that these Jews have some historical claim on the land themselves, although obviously that's in debate because some people think that these are European Jews who are way too distant from the land. But let's put that conversation aside for a second. The fact is that there is a good amount of the population that does have some historical roots there, even if not all of them. So they have some roots there, but most of us living in the US do not have any roots here whatsoever. So we have even less claim onto this land than they do there in Israel, and yet we would still not justify any attacks on the regular population, let alone the rapes and savagery that we witnessed on October 7th, because of some historical fact, a fact that is the situation for most countries that exist, if not most people. As I think Socrates said, every king descended from a line of slaves and every slave descended from a line of kings. We're so mixed and intertwined, we're all squatting on others' territory if you go back far enough. And at some point, we have to move past these historical grievances that we all have if we looked close enough.
If thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of? Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable. However, there are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp which are aimed at contextualizing October 7th. Let's look at them. Number one, history did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. In this conception, Israel was created because land belonging to Palestinians was taken by Western powers and given to European Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Palestinians were not consulted, did not give consent, and found themselves kicked out of their homes. Israel is a settler colonial state. 2. October 7th was a response to Israeli brutality and oppression. Those of you who watched my debate with Safety Hamas will recall that he made this argument repeatedly. The people of Gaza and the West Bank are treated so badly, he argued, the response we saw on October 7th was totally understandable. An act of resistance aimed at redressing the wrongs they have suffered. 3. Israel is killing civilians. The scenes of parents pulling their children out of rubble speak for themselves. 4. Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks, which is why so many innocent people are dying. This argument aims to prove that Israel is the bad guy in this war because it is killing lots of people, either deliberately or due to a callous disregard for the lives of Palestinians. These are, to the best of my knowledge, the 4 principal arguments made by the anti-Israel side. If there are others, please let me know in the comments and I will address them in a follow-up video. Let's go through the arguments one by one, and for the sake of argument, let us accept that every point in each argument is valid and historically accurate. I know many viewers will find this objectionable, but I believe the best way to unpack this entire discussion is to take people's arguments as valid and see if they make sense.
I like where this is going. He's essentially trying to steelman the opponent's arguments. Steelman is essentially taking the strongest points that the other side has to make, and moreover, he's agreeing with these points. He's holding them as valid and then responding to them. So let's see how he responds.
First argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate. It feels reasonable and logical to many people to contextualize Israel's response to October 7th in this way. After all, if Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. Again, let's think from first principles. If we believe every pro-Palestinian claim and accept that Israel was created through the forced placement of European Jews in a foreign land by Western powers, we must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population. Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest. If you go back far enough, so is almost every other country in the world. Like it or not, Israel exists. It's home to over 9 million people. The idea that they would, could, or should accept the destruction of what is now their country is absurd. The United States government would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations. Neither would any government of any country under any circumstances. Peace in the Middle East will not be achieved by attempting to undo many decades of history. The second argument centers on the idea that October 7th was a response to Israeli occupation and brutality. This, again, seems reasonable to many people. After all, what would it take for you to behave the way Hamas did on October 7th? The problem with this argument is that what happened on October 7th was not an attempt to weaken Israel militarily. It was not an attempt to break Hamas militants out of Israeli jails. It was not an attack on the Israeli Defense Force. It was not a prison breakout, as some people like to describe it, because when people break out of a prison, they don't normally head to the nearest town and start massacring women and children. October 7th was, by design and implementation, a terrorist attack whose purpose was to slaughter civilians, terrify Israeli society, and nothing else. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terrorism, which is why Israel had to react to it in the manner that it has, and why any other country would have done the same. The third argument is that Israel is killing civilians. This is the one claim made by the anti-Israel side that is undeniably true. However, this is an example of the emotive but irrelevant context I mentioned earlier. Civilians are always killed in war. The question is not whether they're being killed, but who bears responsibility for their deaths and who can stop the killing. Again, applying first principles thinking, we must reach for a comparable example. There is no exact equivalent that comes to mind, but there is some useful context we can consider. Hamas has repeatedly stated that given the opportunity, they will repeat the October 7th attacks again and again and again. While this may seem shocking to us in the West, it makes perfect sense given that Hamas believes Israel is illegitimate and would like to see it gone. This means that unless Israel destroys or degrades their ability to carry out their threats, it is likely to experience more terrorist attacks again and again. Does anyone seriously believe that any government of any country anywhere in the world would or could react to something like 12 9/11s in one day and the threat of more to follow as many times as possible with anything other than all-out war?
This is yet another point that I think a lot of people who are opposed to Israel seem to be confused about, and that is that Hamas ever since their inception, has made it openly clear that they have no intention whatsoever of coexisting with Israel. For all that we might say about how Israel was established, or how these are European Jews versus the historic Jews, or how Hamas itself was conceived, whether that was because they were reacting to their oppressors, whatever we might disagree about on that, the fact is that we have 9 to 10 million people living in Israel. And the idea that somehow the only options that they have on the table is either to pack up and leave to who knows where, or to die. I don't understand how anyone thinks that either one of these are viable options. And if these are the only options that you have, I'm not sure how such a group that was voted into power by the people of Palestine can lead to any reasonable conclusion. Because again, it boggles the mind to think that a group of people who are fighting for the freedom of their people would put them in harm's way by, one, incurring the sort of reaction that they did after October 7th, and two, using hospitals and civilian facilities as their main strongholds. To be fair, Israel also has their own problems with fanaticism, most unfortunately in very influential places of power. And it's quite difficult for me to garner exactly how much of the population can be described with the same sort of beliefs as those religious fanatics who believe that there is no coexistence between the Jews and the Muslims in that region. But I suspect that a lot of the population, to whatever extent we might consider them fanatics, are no different from the flavor of fanaticism we see in other countries like Saudi Arabia or Japan, where they give more privileges to their own citizens. It might even be argued that Israel does it better when it comes to affording some of these privileges to the non-Jews than some of the other countries that are not often talked about in this context as being oppressors or racist or whatever word we seem to very eagerly levy upon Israel. And I think this is an important distinction to make. It's one thing to say that your neighbors do not get the same amount of privileges and benefits in the country as you do. It's quite another thing to say that we need to exterminate our neighbors because there is no way in hell we're going to be able to coexist together because of their religious beliefs and because of some historical grievance that we have over some land. That to me is a complete non-starter when you consider the time that's passed between Israel being established in that region and the amount of people who live there who, oh, by the way, were fleeing persecution themselves in many parts of the world that were treating them similar to how they're being treated by their neighbors right now.
Does anyone seriously believe that any government of any country anywhere in the world would or could react to something like 12 9/11s in one day and the threat of more to follow as many times as possible with anything other than all-out war? And who can end the killing? Well, theoretically Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. That leaves Hamas, who could have returned the hostages and surrendered the people who took them. What is more, they could hide their civilians in the vast network of tunnels they've built to reduce casualties. Instead, they refuse to build bomb shelters and do everything they can to maximize civilian casualties. That's not my opinion, it's something Hamas are themselves proud of. A senior spokesman for the group, Sami Abu Zuhri, gave an interview on Palestinian station Al-Aqsa TV the last time this conflict flared up. The policy of people confronting Israeli warplanes with their bare chests in order to protect their homes has proven effective against the occupation, he said. We in Hamas call upon our people to adopt this policy in order to protect Palestinian homes. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic, and in a modern world where you can fill your social media feed with gruesome footage, that tragedy can be broadcast straight into your home 24/7. But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone. Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are...
This is probably a point where I diverge a bit from Konstantin in my own cynicism about the people running the show in Israel, and by extension, the people of Israel who democratically elected them into power. There seems to be an unfortunate amount of fanatics running the show, which makes an already intractable situation that much more confounding. And I think it's appropriate to call fanaticism out regardless of which side it's coming from. It's not mutually exclusive. to argue that Hamas has no intention of coexisting with their neighbors, and also argue that there are an unfortunate amount of people in Israeli power who seem to share the same view. These people have openly expressed their lack of intention, their own disinterest in coexisting with their neighbors just as forcefully as the fanatics in the Palestinian side have. And that's before we add the international influence that is using this war as a proxy for their own interests as well. But that being said, and to Konstantin's point here, nothing about the way that the war is being fought is so unconventional or unusual as to reflect that fanaticism of the Israeli side. So if anything, that part of the Israeli power system is being checked. But we can't really notice that if all we're going by are these videos that we see trending on TikTok with kids dying and women and children fleeing, burned down buildings and such. While these have a heavy emotional weight on us, it's important to put that in the context in which Konstantin is doing right now, which is that this is the nature of war. Unless you are a pacifist who thinks that war is never necessary, it's important to realize that these casualties, again, as unfortunate as they are a part and parcel of what it means to be at war. And there are actually a lot of indicators that suggest an immense amount of restraint on the part of Israel, a country that we're accusing of trying to exterminate their neighbors. If that is their intention, they are the worst power that has ever existed with the intention of trying to do that, because that is not being reflected in the statistics that we're seeing.
But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone. Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. This is actually the simplest argument of the four to address because it is an empirical matter. The war in Gaza is not the first conflict in human history. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. What happens when we do? Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. This doesn't mean that there won't be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie. If you need further evidence that claims of Israel's indiscriminate attacks are nonsense, just look at the way various commentators reacted to what has been dubbed Operation Grim Beeper. Thousands of Hezbollah pages were rigged with explosives and then detonated simultaneously, killing and injuring thousands of terrorists and a small number of bystanders. The pages in question were not picked at random. Israel specifically selected a batch of senior Hezbollah operatives. And still, people like Humza Yousaf, Scotland's former First Minister, complain about Israel's indiscriminate attacks. This was definitionally the most precise, targeted and surgical large-scale anti-terrorist operation in human history. In summary, I've engaged with an open mind and in good faith with all the anti-Israel arguments presented to me over the last year. On balance, I regard them as disingenuous, irrelevant, and designed to pull at my heartstrings in order to obscure the harsh reality of this conflict. We would respond exactly the way that Israel has. The only difference is we would do so with the support of every member of the international community, while Israel has to fight not only the terrorists who want to wipe them off the map, but Western apologists for those terrorists as well. If you enjoy these videos,
It's quite interesting to think about the double standard that we impose on Israel in the way that they're conducting this war when compared to the rest of the world, not just presently, but through time immemorial. It seems by all measures that Israel has been extremely restrained. Maybe it's because of the international community and their disinterest in being isolated from that community. But regardless of what the reasons are, it seems pretty evident that they are not set out to exterminate Palestine, as people seem to claim that they are. And on the flip side, they are surrounded by neighbors who have vocalized their intention to get rid of them, with their only option being to pack up and leave or to die. This has been verbalized in so many different ways. It's been codified in the Hamas charter ever since their inception. It's been the views that has been taught in schools in Palestine, and still people seem to ignore the difference in motives between both sides and how that is contributing to the prolongation of this war. I appreciate you watching this video. I hope you got some insights out of it, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.